Right. Well, by my watch, it's right at 10 o'clock this morning, and so in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get our first webinar Wednesday started. So for those of you who are joining us, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. This is our Webinar Wednesdays program that we will be doing weekly between now and the end of December. Very excited to have with us today Scott Bennett from AFBF. Scott has been working with us for the last several months on a report on livestock markets, and he'll be sharing with us a presentation that they've put together today on that working group report, and then he'll be sticking around for questions afterwards. So I know this is going to be a very informative discussion today, and I know it will lead into our policy development discussion next week. So appreciate you guys joining us and spending some time with Scott and listening in on this updates for the livestock markets working group report. So with that, Chelsea, I believe you've got some additional introductions that you'd like to kick off.
We're just going to get right started on the presentation. So we'll cue it up here and get ready to go.
Sounds good.
Good morning and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Even during this challenging pandemic, your exceptional Arizona Farm Bureau staff have found ways to continue providing membership benefits and content to you. On this webinar today, you're going to be talking about the Livestock Marketing Report, which was generated by American Farm Bureau Federation. There's been a lot of frustration widespread across Arizona and the nation coming from ranchers in terms of the beef supply chain and issues with the markets. As a beef producer myself, I totally understand this frustration. It can be extremely discouraging when you put so much time, effort, and money into raising a high quality beef product, only to have the market basically crash the week before your sale and watching boxed beef prices go through the roof. At best, it's disappointing, and at worst, it can put someone out of business. I think we also all understand the nature of the complexities and essentially the consolidations that have occurred in the food supply system. Our food supply system is incredibly complex, but one of the reasons for that is that we're trying to feed a lot of people on very few resources. But we've started to ask ourselves, is this the best system? Can't we have efficiencies in our food production systems and resiliency for the ranchers at the same time? In all of those conversations with those members, in one particular conversation, a member asked that I go to the president of American Farm Bureau, Zippy Duval, and asked that he put together a committee basically taking a deep dive into the beef supply chain, a diverse group of folks from across the country. President Duval did just that. He brought together 10 presidents from across the nation, and we spent over 20 hours listening to industry experts, agricultural economists, and federal regulators just to get a really 360-degree perspective on the beef supply chain and its complexities. With all of that information, we were able to look at have a broader sense of solutions, not just focus on one. Look at the short term and the long term, and try to anticipate unintended consequences of certain directions that we might go. Again, the beef supply chain is incredibly complex, and I hope you've had the opportunity to read the report prior to this webinar, and you will have an appreciation of that. We have to maintain flexibilities, but we also have to have resiliency in each one of those links. We tried to look at a multiple scenario of solutions. Some of those were, have we overlooked outdated and regulatory schemes that are setting ranchers back? Have we missed opportunities to expand markets for local and regional producers? Or are there risk management tools out there, or risk management tools that we need to create in order to better manage uncertainty at the ranch level? If you're looking for a silver bullet in the report, I'm afraid you won't find one. The fact is that we took a 360-degree perspective and tried to look in all areas of the beef supply chain to try and find solutions. And at the end of the day, you, the members, will decide what our policy is and the direction of our advocacy. Thank you for attending the webinar today, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Nevue. I am a livestock economist for the American Farm Bureau Federation. I'm here with one of our directors of congressional relations, Scott Bennett, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about this recent cattle market working group report that AFBF released, and I'm going to give you kind of the lay of the land, what exactly happened to cause President Zippy Duvall to request this group to get put together, and then Scott's going to follow up with a description about what all the report discussed and what the results that came out of that were. So it's really important to understand before COVID, before anybody had ever heard of the virus coming to the U.S. and the economy shutting down, where our livestock and animal protein production was going to be for 2020. So for 2020, we really were looking at a record year in terms of animal protein production and a lot of competition in the meat case. So pretty much across the board, you're looking at poultry, pork, beef, all of them were looking at being record production for us. So going into 2020, we were already going to have a huge availability of supply. Demand was doing great. Per capita consumption of meat, beef as well, had been recovering. We were looking at, again, just a really fantastic year in terms of production and consumption of animal protein. And then along comes COVID. Now, any conversation I'm doing here, and if we join you for the Q&A, I just gotta emphasize, I'm not a medical professional and I'm not an epidemiologist. So when it comes to talking about COVID-19, the best I can really tell you about when we're going to be done with this is there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this. And that uncertainty is what's driving all the disruption that you saw in the market. So when we talk about this 500-pound gorilla in the room, keep in mind that anybody who's sitting here saying with absolute certainty that the markets are going to do this really don't fully know. So there's just so much uncertainty surrounding this, and when we're talking about how we're gonna get out of this, just keep that in mind when I'm going through the slides and talking about where things are going to be moving forward. It's also really important in terms of getting the lay of the land to look at how American consumers were spending their dollars on food, again, before COVID. So before COVID, the last 4 or 5 years here in America, we were spending the majority of our food dollars we spend on food, away from home. So most of that was going to restaurants, fast food. That you can also think of institutional demand in there. So going out to a baseball game, colleges serving food to their students, school lunch, things like that. So most of our food dollars are being spent in this other sector as opposed to being spent at retail and taking the food home and cooking. What happens when you shut down that entire sector of the economy? Fast forward to late March, we start talking about lockdowns going into place. People are shelter-in-place orders are going through a lot of the different states. It's happening at different rates around the country. You can see that reflected in this chart here. So that blue line is food dollars being spent away from home, and you see that drop is pretty dramatic. You see, and also a corresponding increase in the red line, which is grocery stores, retail. So that's what's happening when people are stocking up their freezers, they're panic buying. You're seeing pictures floating around on social media of empty meat cases. So this is what we're seeing at the end of March, early April. I also point out the drop in the blue line, if you look at that, is actually much larger than the increase in the red. That's because we have a lot of value add going into that sector. So think about it this way. If you're going to eat a hamburger, you're going to spend more on that hamburger if you were to purchase it at a restaurant than if you were to make it at home. It makes logical sense. Things tend to be a little bit cheaper whenever you buy it at the retail. So whenever those shut off, a lot of people were thinking that, we're going to do an equal amount of spending at the retail sector, and that just didn't happen because there's a lot of value add going into that product. Something else also to mention here is I like to think of what really happened back in March and, late spring to early summer as two separate events. We have what I'm showing right here is the demand event. And this is, again, you have the lockdowns going into place, you have consumers panic buying at the grocery stores, and you see a lot of concern on social media, in the news, a lot of scary pieces coming out about, do we have a food shortage in this country? And in this demand event, we were not in the case of a food shortage. Okay, thinking about this, it was much more of a short-term logistical supply chain hiccup. And when you shut down that entire demand channel, you think we've become very efficient in this country, and a lot of businesses operate to send food that direction. You can't just snap your fingers and move everything into the retail channel. There's regulations to overcome. Oftentimes, it's just as simple as package sizing. So think about cheese going to shredded mozzarella going to a pizza shop. It's going to be arriving in 20-pound bags or something like that, as opposed to our little 8-ounce containers that we're used, 8-ounce bags of shredded mozzarella we're used to seeing at the grocery store. So there's a lot of stuff going in there to make it really difficult. And our supply chain did, all said and done, at that point, they did a pretty decent job of correcting and moving back over there. And then we fast forward to a little bit later and talk about what I call the supply event, which was we started having a lot of labor issues at processing and slaughter facilities, which ended up creating a situation where we started to see a shortage in meat production. It wasn't just that the meat was there and they're having trouble getting it to the right grocery store shelves. It was actually a case of we're looking at less meat availability. Again, I guess we still have the meat in this country. It's just, say, beef in cow form, as opposed to the situation in the demand event where they had it. They were just figuring out where to get it to. So back to that demand event, we talk about panic buying happening at the grocery store level. This right here shows us a little bit of a picture into what consumers were really trying to get their hands on back again in that late March timeframe. So some of the ones you hear a lot of stories of people increasing their baking. So the price of eggs jumped dramatically. So this is actually showing you the change in retail price from May of last year to May of this year. Ground beef was another one, pork chops. A lot of things kind of make sense. If people are trying to stock up the freezer, you're going to see economical cuts of animal protein like ground beef, maybe roast, other things that are more often available at the grocery store going into freezers. Other things also that people think are going to store a little bit longer, potatoes, sugar. You're seeing just a dramatic increase. Also, you have some of that comfort food, chocolate chip cookies. People are doing a lot more baking type stuff at home as well. And then we fast forward to what I call as the supply event. So I mentioned this didn't really start happening until late April, the first week of May was actually the worst of it when you see the bottom of the V. So when we talk about this was mainly caused by labor issues at the plants. So in this case, you had workers legitimately concerned about contracting coronavirus or COVID by going into work. You have plants starting to, in some cases, being shut down by local governments. In other cases, what I say is the bigger impact that you saw happen is a lot of those plants are operating at reduced capacity, both as they try to institute social distancing within the plants and as well as a result of those labor issues that I was talking about. Sometimes they just couldn't get enough workers to come in and operate the shifts. So the bigger impact you start seeing if plant is operating at 60% capacity, if all the plants in the country are operating at that reduced capacity, you're going to see a lot less animals being processed. And that's exactly what we see here. So we have on the left total cattle slaughter and on the right total hog slaughter. Pretty similar picture. Percentage-wise, it's about the same kind of drop. That was it was very concerning. Again, we saw a lot of pieces running in the news about a food shortage in the U.S. And in this case, they were probably closer, even though I don't think we're ever really at risk of having an actual food shortage. It was more of a case of you're going to have to adjust your shopping list when you're in the store to what's available there. There were still a lot of empty meat cases, but different areas of the country may have seen a shortage of certain animal products versus other areas of the country is probably a little bit more accurate. So you hear a lot of talk about a V-shaped recovery in the economy. That's I think most economists have given up on that and moved more towards maybe a Nike swoosh shape recovery. But when we talk about this really was an actual V-shaped recovery. It was, they were able to adjust and get back online much quicker than most analysts were predicting. So this is to the point where by the 4th of July, most plants are operating back up where they should be. That was a very quick recovery, and a lot of folks were very surprised by how quickly they were able to recover. As of now, cattle slaughter is running a little bit below 5% below-ish last year. Hog slaughter is actually, at least up until this last few weeks, for a while there, was running above last year, in line with what most people had been forecasting them to be at. So one thing that you get as a result of those plants operating at lower capacity is a lot of animals backing up in the supply chain. So this was a huge issue for both, you saw it in poultry as well. In that case, they adjusted by reducing the animals going in by cracking eggs at the front end. But in terms of cattle and hogs, this was a really big issue. Hogs in particular operate on this, what we call just-in-time delivery system. So that was a huge challenge for the hog industry, and they weren't as able to hold them back. You did hear some very unfortunate stories of having to do animal depopulation. It was a really rough go for a lot of hog producers. Cattle, we didn't really hear much about any kind of depopulation. They, while still very much a just-in-time delivery system, they have a little bit more wiggle room and able to hold them back and try your best to slow down the weight gain. But even with slowing down the weight gain, these are living animals, and you're still feeding them, and they're going to gain weight. So one of the results of that backlog and not being able to process those animals in time is we see heavier animals coming to market. So we're getting a little bit better on the cattle side. The last couple of weeks, we've seen the gap between last year and this year shrink. But at the height of it, we were bringing in animals. They basically just didn't do their seasonal decline in terms of dressed weight that you typically see at that time of the year. They just kept them heavy. And one side effect of bringing heavier animals to the market is you're going to have more meat production, so beef and pork. So this is significant because the way to interpret these graphs, I'll point out, is this is year-over-year change in beef and pork production. So if you're over the black line, you're producing more than you were the year before. If you're below, then you're producing less than you were the year before. So the last several weeks, since we were able to recover slaughter capacity, we've been producing more beef and pork than we were last year. That's significant because we're processing less animals. So even though we're running at, say, 95% capacity of where we were last year, the fact that we're bringing such heavier animals to market means that we're just producing more beef and pork. So I think really significant here is when all is said and done, most folks are forecasting us to be, at least in beef production, with just a few percentage points below 2019, which is pretty significant given that 34% drop we saw in early May. So even with that drop, we've seen pretty decent recovery. Pork production is running well above last year, as much as 10% above last year at times. So again, those heavier animals, even though we're processing less animals, we're still getting an increase in beef and pork production. Let's talk about what happened to prices. This graph is frustrated, and I think it frustrated a lot of Farm Bureau members. It's frustrated a lot of cattle producers, pork producers, and it's really, I think, one of the driving forces behind President Duvall's request that we put together this working group to look into what went on. So the working group was actually tasked with looking at both the Holcomb, Kansas packing plant fire that we saw last year, as well as the response to COVID. And this left graph really shows you why we had to look into that. So the graph on the left is what we call the daily. It's the choice box beef cutout, which you can think about the cutout as the value of the cow in meat form. So it's comprised of all the primal cuts, the price, and then what percentage of the carcass they make up, and then that's going to be the equivalent value of the cow in meat form in terms of hundredweight. So that increase was dramatic. Nobody had seen anything like this. You can probably guess that's a historic increase. So remember I was talking about these two different events, the demand versus supply event. So if we look at the blue line in that graph on the left, that's 2020. You actually see, sorry, the demand event occur in that little bump on the left. So that happened late March. We saw that skyrocket, and that really, everybody thought the sky was falling at that time. People begin to realize, there's not really a supply chain, supply shortage at this time. It was just, the supply chain hiccup. They were starting to they were able to reassess and get the meat better to the channels that needed it. And then we start to see the actual supply issue. So this is, we're processing less animals. You have a lot of retailers competing for a smaller and smaller share of beef. And that's what we saw happen with that spike. It just kept going. Nobody knew when it was going to turn around. And then, it's kind of hard to tell in this graph, but it's kind of like gasoline prices as well. It's very much that rockets and feathers phenomenon. It goes up very quickly. And even though it looks like it fell quickly, it definitely fell slower than it went up. We see that, again, happen in gasoline markets. It really happened here. That fall was a little bit slower than most folks were thinking. But then, once we did get back online, it was adjusted, and we actually have seen a little bit of an increase the last month or so, but still operating below where we were for 2019. Now, if you look at the graph on the right, we have the pork cutout. It's a little bit different than the beef cutout. It definitely responded in a similar fashion, but probably not to the same degree as we saw in the box beef cutout. So the pork cutout, one other difference I'm including here, I think it's important, is I included the year 2014, which if you go back to 2014, you remember we had a different virus. That one was only impacting pigs here in the U.S., decimate a large portion of the U.S. herd. And as a result, we saw skyrocketing pork prices. The reason I show that is kind of illustrate, at least on the pork cutout, it wasn't quite the historic event that we saw on the beef side. And in addition to that, you think about consumers, retailers, restaurants. We have in pretty recent memory a case where they saw higher prices than they saw during COVID. So it just wasn't quite as big of a psychological hit that we saw on the beef side as well. So, and I'll put this here as well. This is something that it really, again, one of those important charts that a lot of our folks, our members, a lot of beef producers got really frustrated with. So I'll start out by saying this is not actual beef margins, and I'm very careful to call it the Live-to-Cutout spread. Basically what it is it's the cost of the outputs that the packer may receive, so value of the meat as well as any byproduct value, and subtracting out the cost of the inputs, so the value of a live animal. So this is in terms of 1,000 pounds of steer. It's not per head. One thing that's really important to keep in mind here is it's not including things like labor, energy cost. It's not including these massive fixed costs that a packing plant incurs to build a huge $100 million plant, in addition with a big fixed regulatory cost that goes along with that. It's also not including any of the increased measures that we saw a lot of these companies put in place to keep workers at the plant. So it's costly to put up all those barriers and refigure the plant to encourage social distancing. It's also costly to try and get PPE for their workers. It's also costly to offer these bonuses to get workers to come in. So all that to say, packer margins were very healthy. They're not quite as healthy as this graph would indicate, but during all of this, there's no way around it. These margins were pretty exceedingly healthy. But I think another key point that gets missed is when they're running at that reduced capacity, they're able to spread out those fixed costs over fewer and fewer animals. So if you think about it, and they're operating at normal capacity, they're able to take that fixed cost of building the plant, the capital cost associated with it, as well as that fixed regulatory cost, and spread it out over a larger number of animals. If you're operating at 60% capacity, you're able to spread that over a lot less, and your cost per animal does increase quite a bit. But again, there is no way around the fact that margins were pretty exceedingly healthy, which did frustrate a lot of producers, especially when they were looking at that beef cutout price increasing while seeing the prices they're getting paid for their animals decreasing. With that, I'll kick it over to Scott Bennett.
Hey, thanks, Michael. And welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Bennett. I am the Director of Congressional Relations for American Farm Bureau. I handle the livestock portfolio. I hope you enjoyed Michael's presentation. He did a phenomenal job of kind of giving the lay of the land that we saw from COVID in the cattle and hog markets. As you all recall, last August, in August of 2019, we had the Holcomb, Kansas Tyson plant fire. Saw significant volatility there, and then saw even more significant volatility this past spring due to COVID-19. Back in April, American Farm Bureau President Zippy Duvall tasked 10 State Farm Bureau presidents to serve on the Cattle Market Working Group. The working group worked for over 2 months to look into the volatility in the cattle markets, exactly what the situation was there. We brought in many outside speakers to allow for these state presidents to gather information. That includes land grant economists, staff from Capitol Hill, staff from USDA, representatives from various trade associations, from all various perspectives on the issues that we face today. We made sure that there was representation and presentations to the working group from every sector in the supply chain. So we had the feeder, we had the packer, we had the cow-calf producers, and we had folks that purchase from the packer and sell into retail. And it was very fascinating to go through the process of the working group, because it was very enlightening to hear from every sector and every perspective as to their take as to what's happening in the cattle markets today and what those solutions may look like. What the working group did is, after significant gathering of information and presentations, the Cattle Market Working Group produced a report. I encourage you to look at the report. It has a list of all of the members on the working group. It has a list of all the presenters to the working group. Michael Nepview wrote a easy to read document that outlines his presentation on the volatility. But then at the end of the document, we have 4 kind of overarching themes and consensus points that were discussed over and over by the working group, and they felt the need to address in the report. The first one, and arguably the most discussed, and certainly one that is of interest to folks in the countryside, is a mandatory minimum negotiated trade. Again, after many discussions on this issue with folks from land grant universities coming in and giving their professional analysis of this, what came of it was the working group discussed that there could be a triggered mandatory minimum negotiated trade on a region by region basis that would have various and fluctuating levels. They also put in the report that State Farm Bureau members must be at the table when determining what that trigger may look like, or what those various and fluctuating levels are. The second theme that was discussed is risk management and education. Again, as you saw the volatility in the markets and saw folks really have their risk not managed, and they were on the backside of a lot of the price fluctuations, it became apparent to the working group that that risk management needs to be in place. Now, you might not own an entire futures contract worth of cattle, or you may not understand exactly what insurance products are out there for you to participate in to manage your risk. So the working group put in the document that they would encourage American Farm Bureau to work with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and try and better educate members and come up with solutions that are practical for your smaller producer to manage their risk in times like we saw over COVID-19. The third theme is small capacity meat packing. As Michael alluded to in the presentation he gave, when we saw that weekly slaughter capacity fall significantly, that was due to the fact that workers in these very large packing plants were getting ill. They were having to shut those plants down, disinfect them, and then bring them back up to speed. Well, in the throes of COVID, we saw a move and an interest for smaller packing plants that are a bit more nimble and can continue to operate through COVID. We saw a renewed interest in encouraging them to play a more significant role in the supply chain. In our just-in-time food, in our just-in-time delivery system on cattle, we see that when these large packing plants shut down, it really backs up the supply of food that gets to the grocery store. These small packing facilities have an opportunity now to maybe play a greater role in putting that meat on the grocery store shelves. We've seen a few bills come out this Congress that we support in that effort, and I know that the working group supported those bills as well, and additionally looking at what more could be done to have more robust small capacity meat packing in the United States. And the last theme that the working group really touched on is GIPSA. And we have strong policy at American Farm Bureau currently for GIPSA enforcement. It's imperative that GIPSA maintain fair markets for our producers, and that was reemphasized in this Cattle Market Working Group report. Now that we've kind of covered the themes of the working group report, it's imperative to mention that the reason the working group came up with this report is for policy development. It is for the county and state farm bureaus to read this document and decide for themselves how it may best fit their county or state in proposing policy that will eventually come to American Farm Bureau in January. Of course, when we go back and look at the mandatory minimum negotiated trade, you may ask, well, what do you mean by a triggered mandatory minimum? Well, my answer to you is, in your county or state, let's say Nebraska, their idea of a triggered mandatory minimum may be totally different than the mandatory minimum out of Virginia. So when we see those differences, the working group was not trying to be prescriptive, but rather stimulate discussion and stimulate some ideas so that when we do convene in January at our annual meeting, we'll have many different ideas that we can then vote on and take a look at. And I would encourage you to please look at the Cattle Market Working Group report, read it thoroughly, and I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. And we really appreciate your time today to present to you. Thank you very much.
Well, Scott, we really appreciate you sharing that presentation with us, and appreciate all the work that you and Michael Nephew did in working with that Livestock Working Group at AFBF and putting that report together. If you haven't had a chance to read through that report, it really is a great read. A lot of very valuable information in there about what happened with markets at the outset of COVID-19 and also in the aftermath of the Holcomb, Kansas fire as well. A lot of really good information in there. If you'd like to ask Scott a question, he's going to be joining us for the next 15 minutes or so for a Q&A. If you'd like to ask Scott a question, you can enter those questions using either the chat box or the Q&A box underneath at the bottom of your screen. You'll notice that there's a box there with a question mark in it. If you want to click on that and enter your questions for Scott, we'll share those with Scott and get some of those answered. But to start out, Scott, I've got a question. One of the things that we've heard quite a bit about, and you touched on it during your presentation, was sort of a frustration around pricing transparency and a lack of adequate and robust price discovery when it comes to livestock markets. There are some pieces of legislation out there to address that issue in terms of the mandatory minimum negotiated trade. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those types of policies would have done or could have done to impact prices as a result of disruptions like we had from COVID-19?
Sure. So I'll give a primer really quickly on what mandatory minimum negotiated trade is, and then some of the bills that have been posed to Congress that would address it. So mandatory minimum negotiated trade. So negotiated trade is simply a live transaction, an immediate transaction between the seller and the buyer on a negotiated basis. So an auction sale or something where it's not predetermined, it's not on a grid, it's not on a formula, but it's negotiated right in front of us. So, some of the ideas that have been floated are 30-14 or 50-14. What that means is that a packer would be required to acquire either 30% or 50% of their kill over the next 14 days, so that's the 14, by negotiated trade. A lot of folks feel that, that would increase, price discovery, which it would. It would, in fact, increase price discovery, but I think it doesn't necessarily mean that prices would increase, but rather the discovery of prices would become more robust. And with current policy at American Farm Bureau, those that might sell cattle on a formula basis or on the grid, or have some type of progressive marketing arrangement that would allow the seller to get value above a negotiated cash price, by implementing a mandatory minimum, it could potentially remove producers' ability to sell on a formula or on a grid or add value to their cattle moving forward. Now, if we take a look back at the volatility during COVID or the volatility during Holcomb, it's hard to say if those policies were in place would have helped. It's kind of hard to have that crystal ball of what could have been. Certainly, I believe price discovery would have been more robust, but I don't necessarily know if prices would have been higher for producers. So I encourage folks to understand that by having a mandatory minimum, the price discovery becomes more robust, but that doesn't necessarily equate to higher prices. I did see a question in the question box and about putting a link to the report, and I will certainly do that or get Phil to do that as well.
Yeah, I believe Chelsea just posted a link to the report up there, so you can get access to that as well if you look over in the Q&A chat box, and make sure you leave your questions there. Scott, the Livestock Working Group talked a lot about and discussed in their report some risk management options for cattle producers, particularly smaller cattle producers. Can you expand on that a little bit and help our members understand sort of what the discussion around risk management was and what options may be available out there?
Absolutely. And I'd like to thank, first of all, President Smallhouse from Arizona was on this working group, and she was instrumental
and very vocal in regards to all of the policy discussions that we had and what came out of the report. What I'd like to kind of hit on is, you know, I think a lot of folks are looking for that silver bullet, that one thing that's just going to fix the problems we have in the cattle market, right? But really, we need kind of a plethora of different options that we can use to make sure producers have the upper hand. You know, looking at a mandatory minimum negotiated trade, that's been discussed. It's in the report. I encourage your members to read that report, and different folks will come up with a different conclusion, but certainly the facts are laid out there. But when we look at risk management and education, that was a theme that came up over and over again, is that, you know, if risk management tools were available, easy to use, and in place, then obviously that would help you weather the volatility that we see. You know, many people out there don't have a futures contract load of cattle to use to hedge, or, you know, they might not understand or have access to some of the insurance products. So the working group tasked American Farm Bureau to work with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the CME, on, you know, how can smaller producers have access to risk management solutions? And certainly, if you use risk management as part of your business model, then hopefully you can weather the storm through the volatility. You know, and another thing too, as I kind of go back through the four themes, you know, mandatory minimum negotiated trade being one of them, risk management being another. You know, when we look at small capacity meat packing, that really has come to the forefront here, especially during COVID, when we saw massive plants, you know, the workers get hit with COVID, they would have to shut down, you know, and then enormous capacity would be essentially offline until they could sanitize the plant and the workers became healthy and they could get back to work. So what we saw was, you know, where can we get our meat from? Well, the smaller packers that are a little bit more nimble, that have maybe less employees. Sure, they might not have the efficiencies that you would see in JBS Greeley plant that slaughters an enormous, you know, thousands of head a week, but rather your small local processor that you know has fewer employees, has less risk of getting infected with COVID, or you know, more able to weather the storm. You know, though they certainly have played a role in during COVID. I mean, if you look at some of the custom packing facilities when COVID hit, they immediately became booked up until, you know, well into 2021 here in Virginia. You know, speaking personally from my family farm's experience there. So, you know, by allowing these smaller producers to become FSIS inspected, if they're not, you know, by providing grants there, or, you know, allowing state inspected meat to be sold across state lines, you know, those are some barriers that we should probably work to embrace, you know, and remove those barriers so that the smaller packing capacity can play a, you know, more essential role into our meat supply chain. You know, we support at American Farm Bureau a few bills that already address that, but I look forward to seeing what will come forth in our policy development process in January to see what policy ideas are out there to allow us to further engage in that front.
Yeah, Scott, I'm glad you brought that up. And we have seen quite a bit of well, capacity is an issue for those smaller packing plants out here in Arizona. I mean, you know, as a result of COVID-19, we saw what we believed was, you know, a significant increase in folks wanting to buy retail, and so are directly from the ranchers. However, the small packing facilities have had a tough time keeping up, and the capacity is just not there to do that. And so I know the report included some information on some bills that are working their way through Congress right now. Can you give us an update on bills like the Direct Act and the Ramp Up Act and the small processing facility
Sure.
Holiday Pay Act?
Yeah, so I'll go through those individually. Those are the three big bills that are in Congress right now. They're a few months old. You know, they were introduced kind of in the throes of COVID, and I'll try to do this off the top of my head. So I'll start with the Ramp Up Act. That bill was introduced by Ag Committee Chairman Colin Peterson, who unfortunately lost his re-election bid last night. He has been someone great to work with, and it's a shame that he lost his seat in Minnesota. But until the 117th Congress is sworn in, we're going to work with them on his bill. But the bill would provide up to $100,000 grant for smaller packing facilities to become FSIS inspected. So, you know, as you all know, you can't buy uninspected meat at the grocery store. If you have a custom kill facility, you take your animal there and it's not FSIS inspected, you know, you get your cryovac meat back with a huge label on it that says not for retail sale. And it's available for personal consumption, but not for retail sale. So, you know, some of those facilities may be interested in becoming FSIS inspected. It would generate more business for them, and then the end product could be put on grocery store shelves. So that bill would provide up to $100,000 grant for small and very small packing facilities to become FSIS inspected. The overtime relief bill is probably not as critical at this moment. It was when, you know, we saw the bottleneck, right? When the big packing plants were closed down and the smaller packing plants were still running. So what that bill would do is it would essentially it would force USDA to cover the overtime pay for an FSIS inspector at a small plant. So as you can imagine, you know, if you're only processing 20 head a day, 20 head of cattle a day in a facility, you know, when you move into overtime pay for the inspector, that per head cost goes up, and it may even cause you from being profitable to not being profitable. And so that's simply why some of these plants wouldn't run overtime. But, you know, if by waiving that overtime fee, you know, it may pencil out that the packing facility can now run a Saturday shift or Sunday shift or additional capacity and have it work out. So that was the idea behind the overtime relief bill. That really was geared towards, you know, when we have this bottleneck and that overtime is really, really needed. And the last bill is the Direct Act. And what that would do would allow for state inspected meat to be sold directly to the consumer across state lines. And I'd like to remind folks the big issue around state inspected meat is not that it's, you know, the inspection isn't robust enough for it to be sold across state lines. It's actually the ability to recall the meat. So, I hate to admit that I'm not sure if Arizona has state inspected meat or not. I don't believe you do. In 27,
yeah.
You do, okay.
Yep.
So 27 states have state inspected meat protocols. So if you were to sell your state inspected meat across state lines, and then there was a need to recall that, you know, the Arizona Department of Health can't necessarily go over into New Mexico and say we need to recall this meat. That can't happen. Of course, with FSIS inspection, they preempt any of the state departments of health, and USDA is able to go in and make that recall. But by having a direct to the consumer sale, you know, I think FSIS is less worried about their ability to track that meat and get the recall done. So the Direct Act would allow producers to sell across state lines directly. Those are the three major bills that we see on kind of the small packing capacity front. But, you know, certainly these bills, while they will expire at the end of this Congress, I anticipate them to become new, fresh bills in the 117th Congress, and certainly there'll be a lot of attention put on those. American Farm Bureau supports all three of those bills.
Scott, we've got a question. We've got a question here in the question box, and I'm just going to read it to you. It says cash trade is needed for price transparency, but can you also share with the group the pluses and minuses of increased cash trade on the overall supply chain in terms of how does more or less cash trade impact supply chain efficiencies in terms of managing inventory, expected supplies, value-added premiums, those types of things?
Sure. So I will say I wish we had Michael Nephew here because he's our economist and one of the best in Washington. He does great work for American Farm Bureau on the livestock front. But certainly cash trade is needed for price transparency. You know, that negotiated trade is price discovery. And then, you know, we see a lot of the formula prices actually, you know, they refer back to what a cash price is. So, you know, the concern is that you get such a slim cash trade that it's not reflective of the real market, and then even your formula goes off. So that's where this idea for a mandatory minimum comes about. Now, I would encourage folks to read the cattle report to kind of give it provides some background on the economics of this and kind of answers the question here. But you know, in terms of how does more or less cash trade impact supply chain efficiencies in terms of managing inventory, expected supplies? I mean, you know, if a packer has a mandatory minimum negotiated trade that they need, and say it's 50%, well, say they go out and, you know, they have a packing capacity. I'm going to kind of make this up. So this is we'll use the 5014 bill for an example here. And this kind of goes into managing inventory, expected supplies. So if I own a packing facility that slaughters 2,000 head a week, okay, and that's the most efficient, you know, if I slaughter 2,000 head a week, that's my capacity. So under 5014, that would require me to go out and find 1,000 head of cattle on negotiated trade for slaughter over the next 14 days. Well, let's say I go out and, you know, again, this is just for an example, probably isn't real life, but let's say I go out and I can't find 1,000 head on negotiated trade. There's just not that many fed cattle out there available for me for delivery within the next 2 weeks, and I'm only able to get 900 of the 1,000. Well, if that bill were in place, that means since 50% of my capacity has to be on negotiated trade, that means even though I may have that second 1,000 on a formula contract, well, 100 of those head, I can't make good on that formula contract, because if I only obtain 900 head on negotiated trade, that means I can only slaughter 900 head on formula. So right there, even though I have packing capacity of 2,000 head, in order to not go under 50% negotiated trade slaughter, I'm only going to process 1,800 head. Well, that's 10%. I'm running at 90% capacity. That's not good for the packer. That's not good for the seller, of course. And then there's 100 people, or 100 head of cattle rather, that were under a progressive marketing scheme on the formula that they had to renege on the contract. So, you know, there's as far as supply and putting a mandatory minimum in place, you know, we need to be careful because, you know, it's just not a silver bullet. And in the Cattle Market Working Report, it addresses that in a way that, you know, every region is unique. We should probably look at a mandatory minimum on a region by region basis. Certainly that percentage should be on, you know, have a fluctuating, should be on a fluctuating basis, and then that the input on what that potential fluctuating basis could be, certainly Farm Bureau members better be at the table in determining that, so that the voice is heard. Again, these were all ideas floated out there that are in the Cattle Market Working Group report. As I mentioned in the recorded presentation, this is intended for policy development. So, we look forward to seeing all of the different interpretations of this come January at our annual meeting, because certainly every state has their own opinion of exactly how it should look, because you have your Southeast, you got your Midwest, you got your Southwest, those regions, the cattle industry there is different, and certainly that forms their opinion is different when it comes to what a mandatory negotiated trade should look like.
Well, Scott, we're getting right up to about an hour, but we probably have time for one more question.
Okay.
And it looks like we've got sort of more of a statement than a question here.
Sure.
So I'll let the folks who are participating read that one on their own. Just one other quick question, Scott. I know there was a lot of discussion after Holcomb, and there was certainly some discussion after COVID-19. And when we saw that spread between the processed beef and live cattle, there was a lot of calls for investigations, into the Big Four, into whether they were coordinating on pricing, or there was any sort of antitrust concerns related to their activity. Can you talk a little bit about what we're hearing out of USDA in terms of those investigations, and
yes.
And American Farm Bureau's role in that discussion?
Absolutely. So there's a few things. So I'll kind of give the history of the USDA investigation and where we are today. So after Holcomb, USDA immediately said they were going to investigate the market volatility and come out with a report by the beginning of 2020. Of course, this was, I believe it was August 9th of 2019 that the Holcomb fire happened. So we did not see that report come 2020, and we at American Farm Bureau, of course, this was 2020 BC, before COVID, so we did not know what was yet to come, but we were kicking and screaming saying, you better give us this report, because at the time that was the most extreme volatility we had seen in the cattle markets. And we were demanding them that they show us what they came up with in their investigation. Well, that took some time, and then of course COVID hit and we saw volatility. USDA came out and said, you know what, we're going to include COVID volatility in our analysis of the volatility that happened in Holcomb after Holcomb. So we actually saw their analysis from USDA that came out. Goodness, the months run together now, but that would have been in the summer, late June, early July, and it essentially said that GIPSA at USDA still has investigations ongoing under any collusion or market manipulation that may be happening between the major packers. So while that USDA report didn't exactly show us a smoking gun or anything of that nature, it did give us kind of some ideas around policy that we could develop that could be beneficial and maybe help with some of the volatility that we saw. Of course, that's what the Cattle Market Working Group internal to the AFBF addressed. We also have, we work closely with the CFTC, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, on an investigation there. That investigation is still ongoing. And then, as we know back, I forget now, but it was late spring, early summer, that President Trump charged the Department of Justice to actually engage in an investigation into the volatility and the packing industry. We still await the results of those investigations, but they are being done. They're being taken very seriously, and we at American Farm Bureau support those, and certainly we're going to hold the feet to the fire at USDA, DOJ, and CFTC that they continue to look into these markets and certainly explain to us if there are any manipulation or collusion or any any wrongdoing in the marketplace.
Excellent. Scott, I know we're running up against time, but if you've got time for one more question, we had
Sure.
one more question come in from one of our members. It's a clarifying question. It says the report talks about how mandated cash trade minimums could limit the use of alternative marketing agreements. And the context of that would be value-added cattle pricing arrangements that are typically based on grade and yield. So I guess the question is, how does a minimum cash requirement restrict those formulas, and wouldn't it just adjust the negotiated cash price?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I kind of touched on it earlier. But you know, if a packing facility is required to obtain certain percentage of their slaughter capacity on negotiated trade, then you know, that takes up the shackle space of those that are on a formula. So if let's say a packer right now, you know, we can use Texas for example, just because I kind of know the numbers right now. They sit at about 6 to 8% negotiated trade. You know, the rest of that would be on a grid or a formula. Well, if a mandatory minimum comes in at, you know, 30%, well then that means, you know, that's going to be, you know, my quick math of 6% negotiated trade minus 30. That means 24% of the formula pricing cattle, you know, are not going to be able to, you know, be purchased by the packer in order to be processed. So it doesn't necessarily, you know, you certainly have the option to continue offering on a formula, but you know, by making the packer, by mandating that the packer acquire a certain amount of cattle on negotiated trade, that then reduces the amount of cattle that they can acquire on a formula. And as we know, formula, which is based on negotiated cash, is typically a value add or some type of a premium above cash or above negotiated trade there. So hopefully that answers the question. And of course, that's what our policy development process is for, is to take that question, try and answer it, and go from there.
Well, I can tell you, we believe that there would be quite a bit of discussion in our delegate body related to these issues, and I know you guys anticipate you know, these same policy debates happening around the country, as you know, through the American Farm Bureau policy development process in each of our states and counties. So I know there's going to be a lot of discussions out in the counties and each of the states on a lot of these issues. And I appreciate, Scott, you spending the time with us today to help answer some of these questions and provide some of the information that's going to be valuable to our members as they enter those debates. If you have any more, if you think of any more questions for Scott, please feel free to email those to your staff at Arizona Farm Bureau, myself, or Chelsea, and we'll make sure we get those questions into Scott and see if we can get you guys the answers as we approach our delegate session next week. Look forward to seeing you all there. So. Scott, thanks again for all of your time, and thank you for all the information you provided to our members today. I know this is going to be a valuable discussion as we head into our delegate session next week.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Phil. I appreciate it.
All right. And that concludes our first webinar Wednesday. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us, and I hope you found it to be valuable. Thanks again.